When a decorated black veteran is brutally attacked by an officer in broad daylight, the cop believes his racial injustice will be ignored like so many times before, but he is utterly mistaken. What he fails to understand is that the man he put in a coma has a son with the ability to dismantle the entire system. This is a tale of civil rights, corruption, and an unyielding quest for justice reform that will shake the community to its foundations. Before we delve into this narrative, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you're passionate about justice and accountability, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the small southern town as John Jack Carter walked down the familiar streets. At 68, Jack's pace had slowed with age, but his posture remained upright, and his presence still commanded respect. Townsfolk knew him well, a man who had served his country in Vietnam and spent his life quietly contributing to his community. Today he had spent a few hours at the local Veterans Hall, catching up with old friends over coffee and sharing stories about days gone by. It had been a pleasant afternoon, calm and routine, just how Jack preferred it. As he made his way through the town square, something unusual caught his attention. Across the park near one of the benches, a small crowd was beginning to gather. Jack squinted, trying to discern what was happening. In the center stood Officer Roy McDougal, his solid frame looming over a young man who appeared cornered and anxious. Jack recognized Roy immediately. The officer had a reputation, known for escalating situations rather than diffusing them. Roy had been on the force for years, but tales of his heavy-handed tactics, especially with younger individuals and those who didn't resemble him, had circulated for just as long. The young man, barely out of his teens by the looks of him, stood rigidly as Roy's voice pierced the air. Jack couldn't make out the words, but he noticed the boy's hands trembling as he struggled to retrieve something from his pockets. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Jack could see the fear in the young man's eyes. He glanced around and saw how the small group of onlookers seemed paralyzed, uncertain whether to intervene or walk away. Jack sighed and approached them, his instincts telling him that whatever was occurring was about to escalate. As he neared, Jack kept his voice steady. "Is everything all right here?" Officer Roy's head snapped in Jack's direction, his eyes narrowing at the older man intruding on the scene. "This is none of your business, Carter," Roy said, his voice sharp. "Keep moving." Jack disregarded the harsh tone and focused on the young man, who looked more frightened than anything else. The boy had finally pulled out an ID, his hands shaking as he held it out for Roy to examine. Roy snatched it from him, barely glancing at it before shoving it into his pocket. "I'm just passing through," Jack replied, his voice steady. "It doesn't seem like the boy's causing any trouble." Roy's eyes darkened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Jack could see that he was confronting more than just an aggressive cop. He was facing someone looking for a reason to unleash whatever rage was simmering inside him. "I told you this is none of your concern," Roy growled, stepping closer to Jack as if his physical presence alone would be enough to intimidate him. But Jack had faced down far worse than an angry officer. He didn't flinch. "I've witnessed plenty of situations like this," Jack said, his tone soft yet firm, "and I know when something's about to go south." Roy bristled, his face flushing with fury. He was accustomed to being in control, and now, with the crowd observing, he felt that control slipping. Jack, though quiet and calm, represented something Roy couldn't tolerate, a challenge to his authority. The bystanders shifted uncomfortably, the air thick with tension, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Jack stood his ground. "No need for violence here," he said, his eyes fixed on Roy. "Let the boy go. He doesn't appear to have done anything wrong." That was the final straw. Roy's face contorted with rage, and before Jack could react, Roy shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd gasped, startled by the sudden escalation. Jack regained his footing slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his joints, but refusing to back down. Years of hard-earned patience urged him to turn around and leave this alone, but his conscience wouldn't allow it. There was a time to stand firm, and Jack knew this was one of those times. "You need to back off, officer," Jack said quietly, his voice low, but carrying the weight of someone unafraid of confrontation. But Roy wasn't listening anymore. His fists were clenched, his body taut with anger. Without warning, he swung his fist, landing squarely on Jack's face. The force of the blow sent Jack reeling back, and his body crumpled as he hit the ground hard. His head struck the pavement with a sickening crack. The crowd, paralyzed with shock, stared in horror as blood began to pool beneath Jack's head. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in place. Then chaos erupted. People rushed forward to assist Jack, while others pulled out their phones, recording the shocking scene. Roy, his face pale and breathless from the sudden violence, stepped back, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to manage the situation. He grabbed his radio, barking for backup, his voice shaky. He knew he had to get ahead of this, twist the narrative, make it seem like Jack had been the aggressor. His heart raced as he spun the story in his head, already crafting his defense. But what Roy didn't realize was that his actions had just ignited something far greater than he could ever anticipate. The chaos unfolded rapidly. Jack lay motionless on the ground, his face pale, blood trickling from a gash on the back of his head where it had struck the pavement. His once strong body appeared unnaturally fragile, lifeless. A few bystanders rushed forward, kneeling beside him while others stood frozen, still in shock from what they had just witnessed. "Someone call an ambulance," a woman shouted, her voice trembling with panic. The young man who had been at the center of the original confrontation stood rooted to the spot, eyes wide with terror. He glanced at Officer Roy McDougal, who now looked visibly shaken. Roy's chest rose and fell rapidly, his fists still clenched at his sides as if he was ready for another blow. The aggression that had driven him moments earlier now ebbed into something colder, more calculating. Roy fumbled with his radio, barking into it for immediate backup, though his voice was uneven, betraying his panic. "We've got an injured suspect. Need medical assistance at the park," he said, his words laced with the lie that he hoped would save him. He shot a glance at the small crowd gathering around Jack and straightened his posture, trying to regain control of the situation, but it was already slipping from his grasp. One by one, the bystanders raised their phones, capturing the moment, the still body of Jack Carter, a decorated veteran lying on the ground, and the officer responsible standing over him, looking pale and shaken. It was a scene that would soon spread far beyond this small park. The sirens blared as the ambulance arrived, paramedics rushing out to kneel by Jack's side. One of them, a younger man with urgency in his eyes, checked Jack's pulse, his movements quick and efficient. "Got a pulse, but he's in bad shape," the paramedic muttered to his partner. "Head injury, possible trauma to the brain. We need to get him out of here now." They carefully lifted Jack onto a stretcher, his body limp, as they worked to stabilize him. The crowd murmured in hushed tones, watching in disbelief. Jack was someone they all knew, respected, even admired. To see him laid out like this, to witness the brutality of it, was almost too much to bear. The paramedics wheeled Jack toward the ambulance, his breathing shallow, a thin tube now supplying him oxygen as they worked quickly. Just before they closed the ambulance doors, someone asked, "Will he be okay?" The paramedics' answer was grim. "I don't know." The ambulance sped away, its sirens wailing into the distance, but the tension in the air, the unease remained. Officer Roy stood alone now, the crowd watching him in silence. His initial panic had faded, replaced by a cold, rigid determination. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken judgment in their eyes. His hand twitched toward his holster, but he stopped himself. He wasn't in control of this anymore. Suddenly, a man from the crowd stepped forward, his voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "That wasn't self-defense, Roy. We all saw what you did." Roy's eyes darted to the man, then to the rest of the crowd. The quiet murmurs grew louder. Accusations hung in the air, though no one was brave enough yet to voice them fully. "Back off," Roy barked, trying to maintain authority. He interfered in police business, but his words carried no weight, not anymore. The crowd wasn't listening to him, and the phones were still recording. Whatever power he had moments ago was slipping through his fingers. His stomach twisted as he realized how quickly this could spiral out of control. He turned his back to them, pacing in short, agitated steps, already thinking of his next move. He needed to get his story straight before backup arrived, before more officers saw what had truly happened. When the police chief arrived on the scene minutes later, Roy was quick to speak first. "It got out of hand, Chief," he said, keeping his voice low. "The guy stepped in while I was questioning the kid. He got aggressive, and I had no choice but to defend myself." The police chief, A grizzled man with more years on the force than most stared at Roy for a long moment. His eyes flickered toward the bloodstain on the pavement where Jack had fallen, then toward the group of onlookers still gathered around. He could sense that the situation was already spiraling beyond their control. "I don't care what your story is, McDougal," the chief said, his voice gravelly low enough that only Roy could hear him. "This is going to be a mess, and you'd better hope your version sticks." The chief turned and gestured to one of the other officers who had arrived on the scene. "Clear the area," he ordered, his tone firm. Roy swallowed hard, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He had been in tight situations before, but this was different. This wasn't some petty arrest gone wrong, this was something much bigger. And the longer he stood there, the more he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. Later that evening, word of the incident spread like wildfire. By the time the local news picked up, there were already clips of the confrontation circulating on social media. The videos didn't lie. People could see Jack stepping in calmly, trying to defuse the situation, only to be brutally assaulted by Roy. The public outrage came swiftly. Residents gathered in the town square demanding answers. Justice for Jack signs were hastily scribbled on cardboard as protesters called for Roy's immediate suspension. The story of an honorable veteran being attacked in broad daylight didn't sit well with anyone. Whispers of police brutality, something many had quietly feared but never spoken aloud, were now rising into full-blown cries of injustice. At the hospital, Jack's condition worsened. Doctors worked to relieve the swelling in his brain, but offered no guarantees. He had slipped into a coma, his body unresponsive, the prognosis uncertain. The hospital room, once a place for recovery, had become a waiting room for life-altering news. Outside the hospital, a small crowd gathered, friends and family of Jack standing vigil, praying for his recovery. Among them were fellow veterans, men who had once served alongside Jack or knew him from the local hall. Their faces were etched with quiet rage, sadness, and disbelief. As night fell and tension hung thick in the air, people began to realize something terrible. This wouldn't be easily forgotten. Jack Carter, the man they all respected, lay between life and death, and the town had reached a boiling point. It was early evening when Michael Carter's phone buzzed, pulling his attention from the documents scattered across his desk. He was in his office, the walls lined with accolades and degrees, a testament to the journey that had brought him to this position as the state attorney general. Michael was accustomed to receiving calls at all hours of the day, calls about cases, political issues, or civil rights violations that demanded his attention. But this call was different. He picked up the phone, not recognizing the number. "Carter," he said, his voice brisk and professional. The voice on the other end was shaky. "Mr. Carter, I don't know how to say this, but it's about your father." Michael's pulse quickened. "My father?" he asked, his calm exterior suddenly beginning to crack. "What happened?" the woman explained quickly, her words tumbling over one another. "There was an incident. He was hurt badly. He's at the hospital in a coma. It was a police officer. There was an altercation in the park. You should get here." The words slammed into Michael like a freight train. His father, Jack Carter, the man who had always been a pillar of strength, who had survived war and years of hard work, was now lying in a hospital bed, unconscious and barely clinging to life. For a moment, Michael didn't move, his mind trying to process the enormity of what he'd just been told. His father hurt by a cop, in a coma. "Are you there, Mr. Carter?" the voice on the phone asked hesitantly. "I'm here," Michael answered, his voice now low, calm. "I'm coming." He ended the call, his hand trembling slightly as he placed the phone back on his desk. Michael sat there for a long moment, his thoughts racing. He knew what this meant. His father had been injured not by some random accident, but by the very people who were supposed to protect him. And now, lying in a hospital bed, he might never wake up. But the full gravity of the situation hadn't even hit yet. That officer, whoever he was, had no idea who Jack's son was. He had no idea that the man he'd put in the hospital was the father of the state's top law enforcement official, the man who had made it his life's work to fight for justice and accountability. Michael stood abruptly, pulling on his jacket, his mind already shifting into action mode. He'd seen this kind of thing before, cases of police misconduct, cover-ups, and attempts to brush aside the truth. But this time, it wasn't just any case. This time, it was personal. His office, sleek and professional, seemed too quiet now, the calm before a storm. This officer had no idea what he'd set in motion. Michael wasn't coming as just another concerned family member. He was coming as the Attorney General, a man with the power to dismantle a corrupt system and expose every lie, every injustice. He grabbed his briefcase and headed out the door. He would stop by the hospital first to see his father, but after that he would ensure every officer involved, every person who had stood by and done nothing, paid the price. It was nearly nightfall when Michael arrived at the hospital. His mind was racing, but his face was a mask of calm control. Years of legal battles and public service had taught him to compartmentalize, to push down emotions until it was time to act. But seeing his father, Jack Carter, the man who had raised him, taught him to fight for what was right. Lying unconscious on a hospital bed, tubes running from his arms, his face pale and still, was almost too much to bear. Michael stood at the edge of the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His father looked so small, so fragile. The sound of the machines filled the silence, each beep of the monitor like a ticking clock counting down the moments he had left to make things right. A nurse entered the room quietly, her face somber. "He's stable for now, but the head injury." She trailed off, searching for the right words. "It's serious. We're doing everything we can." Michael nodded, his eyes never leaving his father's face. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but controlled. She offered a sad smile and slipped out of the room, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. For a moment, all he could hear was the rhythmic beeping of the machines, his mind replaying the words he had heard over the phone. Police officer, altercation, coma. A cop did this, and now the cop would face the full force of justice. Michael exhaled sharply, feeling his anger burn hotter beneath the surface. His father, a man who had served his country with dignity, was lying in a hospital bed because of someone who had sworn to protect people, not harm them. The hypocrisy was suffocating, but Michael wouldn't let his emotions take over. There was work to do. The town was buzzing with activity by the time Michael stepped outside the hospital. News of the incident had spread quickly, and protests were already forming. A large crowd had gathered outside the police station demanding answers, holding signs with Jack's name scrawled on them. Michael had anticipated this. The videos of the attack had gone viral, and the entire state was watching. Michael's face was familiar to many of them. He was no stranger to the public eye, but now his presence carried a different weight. The reporters waiting outside the hospital recognized him immediately, their voices rising with questions. Few reporters pushed forward, their cameras capturing every movement. "Mr. Carter, can you comment on the condition of your father? Do you have any response to the officer's actions?" Michael straightened, his voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. "My father is in critical condition," he said, his tone measured, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable. "There will be a full investigation, and I won't rest until the truth is exposed and justice is served." The crowd quieted, the reporters scribbling down notes, cameras still rolling, capturing the weight of Michael's words. Without another word, Michael turned and walked toward his car. His legal team had already been alerted, and they were assembling evidence as he prepared to confront the system that had allowed this to happen. The officer who had put his father in that hospital bed had no idea what was coming. The next morning, the air in the town felt heavier. Jack's face, a man known and respected for his service, was splashed across news networks, and the image of him lying unconscious in the park became a symbol for something much larger. But for Michael Carter, this wasn't just about symbols or headlines. This was his father. The weight of that fact pressed heavily on him as he sat in his office. His team gathered around him, reviewing the evidence that had been collected so far. He had been up all night, poring over every detail. The witness statements, the footage of the attack, the reports filed by the police department. The picture was becoming clear, and it wasn't pretty. Officer Roy McDougal had used excessive force, and now his father was in a coma because of it. But it wasn't just about McDougal. Michael knew that the problem went deeper. "Roy's been a problem for a long time," Michael's legal advisor said, flipping through McDougal's personnel file, which had been sent over by a whistleblower inside the department. Multiple complaints of excessive force, harassment, racial bias, all swept under the rug. "He's been protected." Michael's jaw tightened. How far back do the complaints go? Years, the advisor replied. Most of them never even made it to the review board. But now, with the video evidence and the public outcry, they won't be able to cover it up this time. Michael nodded, absorbing the information. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about the department's culture of protectionism, the way they'd allowed officers like McDougal to operate without consequence for far too long. He glanced at the footage of the attack once more, the image of Roy punching his father playing out in slow motion on the screen in front of him. The blow, the fall, the blood pooling beneath Jack's head. It was a sight he would never forget. We'll press charges against McDougal, Michael said, his voice steady. But we're not stopping there. I want a full investigation into the department's handling of his complaints. If there's corruption, we'll expose it, and anyone who covered for him is going down with him. His team nodded in agreement. They knew Michael wasn't one to pull punches when it came to justice. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Roy McDougal was sitting in the police station, his nerves frayed, as he watched the fallout from the incident unfold. The news reports were relentless. His name was plastered across the headlines, and his actions were being dissected by every media outlet in the state. The town was in an uproar, and protesters had gathered outside the station, calling for his arrest. Roy was no stranger to trouble, but this was different. This was spiraling out of control. Roy, you've got to lay low for a while, the police chief said, pacing back and forth in front of him. This is turning into a storm. The state attorney general is on this. Michael Carter's his son, for God's sake. How was I supposed to know? Roy snapped, panic creeping into his voice. He didn't say anything. He just stepped in. And you think that's going to matter? The chief cut him off. You think anyone's going to care what he said or didn't say? There are videos, Roy. People saw what you did. Roy sat back in his chair, rubbing his forehead with the palm of his hand. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had screwed up badly, and now there was nowhere to hide. The chief sighed, leaning against the desk, arms crossed. We'll do what we can to protect you, but if Carter's involved... He trailed off, leaving the rest of the sentence unsaid. If Michael Carter was leading the investigation, there would be no protection. The chief knew it, and so did Roy. That afternoon, Michael held his first press conference in front of the courthouse, standing tall as the cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions from the crowd. His face was calm, composed, but there was a fire in his eyes that everyone could see. I want to be clear, Michael began, his voice firm and measured. We will be conducting a full investigation into the events that took place in the park and the actions of Officer Roy McDougal. There will be no cover-ups, no protection for those responsible. Justice will be served. The crowd of reporters fell silent, their pens scratching furiously across notepads. Michael's reputation preceded him. He was known for his zero-tolerance approach to corruption, and now with his father lying in a hospital bed, no one doubted that he would pursue this case with unrelenting force. We will be pressing charges against Officer McDougal for the assault on my father, Jack Carter, Michael continued. But this investigation will go beyond just the actions of one officer. We are looking into the police department's handling of prior complaints against Officer McDougal, and we will ensure that any misconduct within the department is brought to light. Michael didn't raise his voice, but the gravity of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. There was no question about his resolve. He wasn't just coming after McDougal. He was coming after everyone who had protected him, everyone who had allowed him to act with violence and impunity. A reporter stepped forward, his voice carrying above the murmurs. Mr. Carter, can you comment on your father's condition? Is there any update? Michael's expression shifted, a flicker of emotion crossing his face before he regained his composure. My father remains in critical condition, he said quietly. We are hopeful, but we are prepared for whatever comes next. The silence that followed was heavy, the reporters exchanging glances. They could see the weight Michael was carrying, but they also saw the determination that had defined his career. The press conference ended shortly after that, but the message had been delivered. Michael Carter was coming for justice, and nothing, not a corrupt officer, not a complicit department, would stand in his way. Back at the police station, the chief stared out of his office window, watching the protesters gather outside. The crowd was growing larger by the hour, and the chants of justice for Jack echoed through the streets. He turned back to Roy, who was sitting in the corner, his head in his hands. We can't protect you from this, the chief said grimly. "You're on your own." Roy didn't respond, his mind spinning with the weight of what was coming. The sound of protesters chanting outside his office filled Michael Carter's ears as he sat at his desk, reviewing the files in front of him. Days had passed since his father's brutal assault, and while Michael's team had made significant progress in the investigation, the weight of the case was taking its toll. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father lying motionless in that hospital bed, tubes and machines keeping him alive. He glanced at the clock. It was late afternoon already, but the day had barely slowed down. His team was in overdrive, pulling together evidence, filing motions, and preparing for what would likely be a long and grueling fight. There were too many eyes on this case, too much at stake for him to falter. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was one of his lead investigators. "We've dug deeper into McDougal's history," the investigator said. "It's worse than we thought. Not only does he have a pattern of excessive force, but we found internal memos from the department about his conduct." The chief knew. He knew McDougal was a problem. Michael's jaw tightened as he gripped the phone. It was one thing to have suspected that the department had covered for Roy. It was another to have proof. He knew that corruption was endemic in certain parts of law enforcement, but the fact that it had gone on for so long with officers like Roy being protected was staggering. "Get me everything," Michael said, his voice low but firm. "Every memo, every internal report, everything they tried to bury will be brought into the light." "Understood," the investigator replied. "There's more. The chief is starting to get skittish. Word is he's feeling the pressure. I think we're close to a break." Michael hung up and stared out the window at the growing crowd of protesters in front of the courthouse. The town was coming to a boiling point, and he knew that if they didn't get justice soon, the unrest could spiral out of control. But even as Michael prepared to dismantle the corruption in the police department, he felt an internal conflict growing. He had always been methodical, deliberate in his actions, never emotional. He couldn't afford to be emotional now. But with every step forward, with every piece of evidence his team uncovered, he felt the rage building inside him. This wasn't just a case. This was personal. His father, a man who had served his country, a man who had been a symbol of strength and resilience, was now lying in a coma because of a system that had failed him. Michael's heart ached every time he thought about Jack, about all the things his father had taught him, all the values he had instilled in him. Justice, integrity, doing what was right even when it was hard. Michael had followed those lessons throughout his career, fighting tirelessly for justice. But now, as he stood on the brink of exposing the corruption that had allowed his father's attacker to operate freely, he felt the familiar tug of grief and anger threatening to overwhelm him. Meanwhile, across town, Roy McDougal sat in the cramped apartment he had been hiding in for the past few days. The walls seemed to close in on him as he watched the news cycle tear him apart piece by piece. Every headline, every news report, every angry tweet from the protesters outside the police station painted him as a monster. He'd been suspended from the force. His career was likely over. The chief had all but thrown him to the wolves, telling him to lay low and hope for the best. But Roy knew there was no hiding from this, not with Michael Carter leading the charge. Roy's phone buzzed, and for a moment he hesitated before answering. It was his lawyer. "They're coming after you, Roy," the lawyer said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "They've got video evidence, and they're digging into your record. There's not much I can do unless you're willing to cut a deal." Roy's blood ran cold. "A deal? I can't go to prison." "There's not much choice here," the lawyer continued. "Carter's building a solid case. If you don't cooperate, they're going to come down on you with everything they've got." Roy didn't respond. He knew the lawyer was right, but the thought of what was coming terrified him. He wasn't just facing public backlash anymore. He was facing jail time, real consequences, and there was no way out. Back at the hospital, Jack's condition remained the same. The doctors were doing everything they could, but his coma was deep, and the prognosis was still uncertain. Jack's friends and fellow veterans had taken turns keeping vigil at his bedside, their presence a quiet but constant show of solidarity. Michael visited the hospital each day, spending what little time he could by his father's side. But each visit weighed heavier on him. Jack looked so small, so still. The man who had always been a force of nature in Michael's life now lay motionless, barely clinging to life. "Hey, Dad," Michael whispered one evening as he sat beside the hospital bed, his hand resting on Jack's. I'm doing everything I can. I'm going to get justice for you, I promise." The machines beeped softly, the steady rhythm of Jack's heartbeat, the only sound in the room. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes burning from exhaustion and grief. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when he doubted whether he had the strength to continue. The case was personal, too personal, and sometimes it felt like the weight of it might crush him. But then he remembered his father's voice, remembered the lessons he had taught him. "You don't back down from a fight, son. You don't stop until it's done." And so, with that thought steadying him, Michael wiped his eyes and stood up. There was still work to be done, and as long as his father was fighting to stay alive, Michael would keep fighting too. The walls of the police chief's office felt unusually tight as Michael Carter stepped inside. His face unreadable, but his presence heavy with authority. Chief Leland Green sat behind his desk, arms crossed, trying to maintain some semblance of control. But the tension in the room was undeniable. The department was under siege, and he knew that Michael Carter wasn't here for a polite conversation. Michael took his time surveying the office, his eyes sweeping over the framed accolades on the wall, the photographs of Green with smiling officers, and the department's insignia that hung behind the chief's desk, all symbols of an institution that had failed his father, failed the community, and had allowed corruption to fester within its ranks. Chief Green cleared his throat, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Attorney General Carter, I appreciate you coming in to discuss." "Save it," Michael cut in, his voice firm. He didn't bother sitting down. "We're not here for small talk." Chief Green stiffened, the false smile dropping from his face. "Now hold on," he began. McDougal acted on his own. This wasn't some conspiracy by the department. The man's always had a temper, but that temper cost my father his life, Michael interrupted, his voice cold. "And it's not just about McDougal. This is about how your department handled his complaints, the cover-ups, and the culture of silence you allowed to take root under your watch." Green leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking tired, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He'd known Michael Carter for years, had seen him rise through the ranks of the legal world to become the state attorney general. But this was a version of him Green had never encountered before. Relentless, unyielding. Michael didn't stop. "We have evidence, Chief. Internal memos documenting complaints against McDougal that were dismissed without proper investigation. Memos with your signature on them." Green's face paled. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He could feel the walls closing in on him. Michael wasn't bluffing. He had the evidence, and if it came to light, Green's career would be over. And worse, the department would be exposed for what it truly was, a place where corruption had been allowed to thrive. "We're filing charges against Roy McDougal for assault and misconduct," Michael continued, his voice steady and cold. "But we're not stopping there. We're launching a full investigation into your department. Every complaint that was swept under the rug, every report that was altered to protect your officers. It's all going to come out." Green shifted in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. "Carter, you know how this works," he said, his voice low. "Sometimes things get messy. Sometimes we have to look out for our own." Michael's eyes flashed with anger. "Your job isn't to protect corrupt officers. Your job is to protect this community. You failed at that, and now you're going to face the consequences." For a long moment, the room was silent. The weight of Michael's words hung in the air, and Green knew there was no escape. His mind raced, trying to calculate a way out, but he saw no opening. Finally, Green slumped back in his chair, defeat written across his face. "What do you want from me?" Michael didn't blink. "I want full cooperation with the investigation. I want every file, every memo, every email related to McDougal's misconduct on my desk by the end of the day. And I want your department to issue a public statement acknowledging the failures that led to my father's attack." Green swallowed hard, knowing he had no other choice. "You'll get it," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael didn't linger. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, his steps measured, assured, and precise. The police chief sat behind his desk, staring at the door, his career hanging by a thread, his department on the brink of collapse. Across town, Roy McDougal was drowning in fear. He sat in his apartment, staring at the wall. Every time he turned on the television or checked his phone, his name was plastered across the headlines. Officer Roy McDougal, the man who put a beloved veteran in a coma. His lawyer had told him to lay low, but Roy knew that wasn't enough. He knew what was coming. Michael Carter had built a career on taking down men like him, officers who thought they could get away with abusing their power. And now, Michael had every reason in the world to come after him with everything he had. Roy's hands shook as he picked up his phone, scrolling through the endless barrage of news articles, each one worse than the last. They were digging into his past, pulling up every complaint, every incident where he had overstepped. It was all coming out now, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He thought about the punch, the way Jack had hit the ground, the way his head had cracked against the pavement. He hadn't meant for it to go that far. He had been angry, sure, but he hadn't meant to put the old man in a coma. But that didn't matter now. Intent didn't matter. The damage was done, and Roy knew that his time was running out. Back in his office, Michael Carter stood in front of a large window overlooking the courthouse square. Michael could feel the tide turning. The investigation was making progress. The pieces were falling into place. And soon, very soon, there would be nowhere for Roy McDougal or the corrupt officers who had protected him to hide. His phone buzzed. It was his lead investigator again. "We've got what we need," she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "The chief is cooperating, and the files are coming in. We've uncovered more complaints against McDougal, racially motivated stops, excessive force reports, all buried. And it's not just him. This whole department is infected." Michael nodded, feeling a surge of grim satisfaction. "Good, keep digging. We're going to tear this whole thing down." He ended the call, his gaze still focused on the protesters below. The town was on the verge of something big, something that would change it forever, and Michael was ready to lead the charge. The courthouse was swarming with reporters and protesters, their voices blending into a single roar as they crowded around the steps. The town was on edge, waiting for one thing: the arrest of Officer Roy McDougal. Inside, Michael Carter sat at a table surrounded by his legal team, their faces calm and focused. The moment they had been building toward was finally here. After weeks of investigation, after uncovering every lie, every buried report, every complaint against Roy McDougal, they were ready to bring him to justice. Michael glanced at the thick stack of papers in front of him. The indictment. It had taken days of careful review, but the charges were set: assault, misconduct, and a history of racially biased behavior that had been ignored by the police department for years. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was no longer any doubt that Roy would face the full weight of the law. The door to the room opened, and Michael's lead investigator walked in, her expression tense but determined. "It's time," she said. Michael nodded, rising to his feet. He'd been waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to hold Roy accountable for what he had done to his father. But as he walked toward the courtroom, there was a part of him that still felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about Roy McDougal anymore. This was about a broken system, a system that had failed his father and so many others like him. As Officer Roy McDougal was led toward the courthouse, flanked by officers, the crowd erupted into boos and shouts. The sight of him, his once cocky demeanor replaced by the pale, haunted look of a man whose world was crumbling, only fueled the anger of the protesters. Roy kept his head down, his shoulders hunched, but the weight of the public's fury bore down on him like a physical force. He could hear the chants, feel the stares burning into him. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He had thought he could lie his way out of this, that the department would protect him like they always had. But now, as he approached the courthouse steps, he realized the truth. They were throwing him to the wolves. The officers escorting him didn't say a word. There was no solidarity, no sense of brotherhood. He was alone now, just like the chief had warned him. His hands were shackled, and his mind raced as he tried to figure out what had gone so wrong. Inside the courtroom, Michael stood tall as the judge entered. The room was packed with reporters, town officials, and a few familiar faces, friends of his father, veterans who had stood by Jack throughout his life. They were here to see justice, and Michael was determined not to let them down. The judge cleared her throat, her voice echoing through the tense silence of the room. "We are here to formally indict Officer Roy McDougal on charges of felonious assault, official misconduct, and violations of civil rights. The court will now proceed with the reading of the charges. As the charges were read aloud, Michael watched Roy's face closely. There was no fight left in him, no bravado. Roy sat motionless, his face pale, his eyes staring blankly ahead as the weight of the indictment pressed down on him. The evidence was overwhelming. The video footage, the witness testimonies, the internal reports that had been buried by the department. It was all out in the open now. There was no escaping it. When the judge finished, Roy's lawyer rose, looking resigned. "We waive the reading of the indictment, Your Honor," he said quietly. "My client understands the charges." The courtroom fell into a tense silence, all eyes on Roy as he was led back out of the room, still in handcuffs. The formal indictment was done, and Roy McDougal would now face trial. There was no celebration, no cheering in the courtroom, just the somber reality of what had been done. But outside, it was a different story. The moment the news broke that Roy McDougal had been indicted, the crowd outside the courthouse erupted into cheers. For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that justice could be served, that the system could be reformed, that the corruption that had allowed officers like Roy to operate with impunity would finally be dismantled. Michael Carter stepped outside the courthouse, standing on the steps as he addressed the crowd. The cameras turned toward him, the reporters leaning forward, waiting to capture his words. "This is just the beginning," Michael said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "Officer Roy McDougal will face trial for his actions, and we will ensure that justice is served. But this is not just about one officer. This is about a system that allowed this to happen. A system that failed my father and failed this community." The crowd fell silent, listening intently. "We are conducting a full investigation into the police department's handling of complaints, and we will hold anyone who participated in the cover-up accountable. There will be reforms. There will be changes. This community deserves better, and we will not stop until those responsible for these failures are brought to justice." The crowd erupted again, cheers and applause filling the air. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory, a step toward the justice they had been demanding. Back at the police station, Chief Green sat in his office, staring blankly at the wall. The files had been handed over, the cover-up exposed, and his role in protecting Roy McDougal had been laid bare. The department was in shambles, and the protests outside had become a daily reminder of how badly things had gone wrong. He knew his days were numbered. The investigation into the department was only going to get worse, and it was only a matter of time before he was forced to step down. Michael Carter's office had been relentless, uncovering every misstep, every failure, and now the department's reputation was in tatters. Green leaned back in his chair, the weight of his career pressing down on him. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the price. As Michael left the courthouse, his phone buzzed. It was the hospital. His heart sank as he answered. "Mr. Carter, it's about your father." Michael Carter's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his phone. The nurse on the other end of the line repeated herself, her voice gentle but firm. "Your father's condition has changed, Mr. Carter." For a moment, Michael stood frozen on the courthouse steps, his mind racing. Jack had been in a coma for weeks, and though his condition had stabilized, the doctors had warned him that things could change at any time. He had braced himself for this moment, but somehow felt completely unprepared. His car sped through the town as the streets blurred past him, the sounds of chanting protesters fading in the distance. The hospital loomed ahead, the same place he had visited every day since the attack. Each time, Jack had been the same, still, quiet, unchanged. But now, something was different. The nurses guided him to the familiar room. Jack lay there motionless as always, the machines beeping rhythmically, keeping time with his shallow breaths. The doctor was waiting for him, his expression carefully neutral. "He's stable for now, but..." The doctor hesitated, then sighed. "His brain activity is minimal. If there's no improvement soon, you may need to consider your options." Michael's breath caught in his throat. The legal battles, the indictments, the reforms, all of it felt small in comparison to the fragility of life in this room. He had fought for justice, for accountability. But what about the person lying here? What about his father, the man who had raised him, taught him right from wrong, taught him to never back down? Michael sat at his father's side, the hum of the machines fading into the background. For the first time since the incident, He felt overwhelmed, not by the weight of his office or the expectations of justice, but by the very human grief of possibly losing his father. He hadn't said goodbye. He had spent so much time fighting the system, fighting for reform, that he hadn't made peace with the thought that Jack might never wake up. He squeezed his father's hand, his voice a low whisper. "I'm still fighting for you, Dad. We're getting justice, but I need you to come back. I need you here." The beeping of the machines remained steady, unchanged. Outside the hospital, the indictment of Roy McDougal continued to ripple through the town. The protests had grown even larger, but now they were filled with hope. Roy's trial was set, and the community believed for the first time in a long while that change was possible. But Michael knew that one indictment wasn't enough. His team had continued to dig into the police department's records, uncovering a pattern of systemic neglect that went back years. Officers with repeated complaints of racial bias, excessive force, and misconduct had been protected, shielded from consequences by the leadership. The entire department had operated on a culture of silence and complicity. Michael's legal team was already preparing to issue a report, one that would force the department to reckon with its failures. The chief had been exposed for his role in covering up misconduct, and the calls for his resignation were growing louder. The town was ready for change, and Michael was determined to deliver it. Several days later, the crowd gathered once again in front of the courthouse, this time for a different reason. The police chief, after days of mounting pressure, had finally announced his resignation. His departure was seen as a victory for the community, a sign that real change was beginning to take hold. Standing on the courthouse steps, Michael Carter addressed the crowd. He had kept his promises so far. Roy had been indicted, the chief had resigned, and the investigation into the department was continuing. But he knew the road ahead was long. "The indictment of Officer McDougal and the resignation of Chief Green are steps toward justice," Michael said, his voice steady and resolute. "But we are not done. My office is committed to overseeing the reform of this police department to ensure that this kind of corruption and misconduct can never happen again." The crowd cheered, the sense of triumph palpable, but Michael remained focused. He knew that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about creating a system that was better, fairer, more just. As the crowd dispersed, a familiar figure approached Michael from the side of the steps. Sarah Thompson, one of the local civil rights activists, extended her hand. They had worked together in the weeks following the attack on Jack, and her leadership had been instrumental in organizing the protests and keeping the pressure on the department. "You did it, Michael," Sarah said, smiling softly. "You brought justice." Michael shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "We did it, and we've got a long way to go." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The community had fought hard, but there was still healing to be done. Later that evening, Michael returned to the hospital. The room was quiet, the machine still humming softly, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling the air. He sat by Jack's side once again, his heart heavy but a little lighter than before. He had done everything he could, everything his father had taught him to do, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. He looked at his father, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of his face, the deep wrinkles that spoke of a life lived through hardship and triumph. Jack had always been strong, but now, as Michael watched him lying there, still and silent, he realized that strength wasn't just in the fight, it was in the resilience that followed, the quiet determination to keep going even when everything seemed lost. Michael leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "I know you're still in there, Dad. I know you're still fighting, and I'll keep fighting with you." For a long moment there was nothing but the soft beep of the monitors, and then, almost imperceptibly, Jack's fingers twitched. Michael froze, his heart leaping in his chest. The movement was slight, almost nothing, but it was there. Jack's eyelids fluttered, his breath hitching slightly as if his body was slowly waking from a deep sleep. Michael leaned closer, his pulse racing as he watched for any other signs of movement. The doctor rushed in, the nurses following close behind, but Michael barely noticed them. His eyes were locked on his father's hand, on the slight tremor that ran through his fingers. It was small, so small, but it was enough. Jack was still fighting. Over the next few days, Jack's condition slowly improved. He was far from fully recovered, but there was hope. Hope that he would wake, hope that he would heal. And as Jack fought for his life, Michael continued to fight for justice. The trial of Roy McDougal loomed ahead. The investigation into the police department was underway, and the town was beginning to rebuild itself. The process of reform had begun, and though the road would be long, there was a sense that real, lasting change was possible. The town had been shaken, broken even, but from that brokenness, something new was emerging. A community that had seen the worst of its systems and was now committed to building something better. As Michael sat by his father's side, he reflected on the journey they had been through, the pain and the struggle, but he also saw the resilience, the determination to fight for a better future. And in that moment, as the sun set over the town, casting long shadows across the streets, Michael knew that justice was not just about the law. It was about healing, about standing up for what was right, and about creating a world where people like his father could live without fear. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Michael Carter knew one thing for sure: they were on the right path. If you enjoyed this story, give the video a like. What was your favorite part of the story? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.